We're now on Daf Kufa Mid Beis, and we're up to Rav. Afilu Temelo Kono Besilko. We're trying to interpret the statement of Rav, who says that we're trying to calculate whether there's Nesinas Tam in the Tarovas or not, and we're going to say it's a case where the Dag Tome has lost its identity in the Tarovas. We cannot pull it out of the pot and separate it. And yet, we're not going to apply the principle of min b'mino afilu be'elef lo bat. And this is called the famous principle of Rava of Salik. Well, let's see if we can understand what Salik is all about. First, let's read it inside. Have min umino v'davar acher. The non-kosher fish fell into a pot that's made up of conceptually two categorically different elements. Element number one is min b'mino. There are other pieces of kosher fish in the pot. But there's also min b'she'eno mino, because there are liquids and juices and spices and whatnot, maybe even bones. You have a lot of sediments, different things that are in, that's already min b'she'eno mino. So now what do? We're in a tug of war. Should we apply the principle of min b'mino? Once we apply the principle of min b'mino elef lo batel, then all the pieces of kosher fish now become asur. And once they become asur, they in turn will prohibit all the rest of the materials in the pot. Or should we say no? Why don't we do salik? Salik means let's put aside the mino element and focus exclusively on the non-mino element. So we're going to subtract the other pieces of meat, of kosher meat, from the pot, and what we're left with is min b'she'eno mino. Now let's say there's min b'she'eno mino and there's bittul. Then we mavatel the tam of the isur, and even the chaticha of isur that fell in, which we cannot identify, is batel through the principle of salik. And that's what the Gemara says now. Min b'mino vid davar acher, meaning it's min b'mino plus min b'she'eno mino. And in such a case of kol min b'mino vid davar acher, salik is mino k'mishe'eno, meaning we're going to take the, let's say, legal opportunity to choose in our calculation, evaluation of bittul, choose the element of she'eno mino, leaving out for the time being the element of min b'mino. And now what I could say is, if I have enough in the eno mino, as we said before, the sediments and the liquids and the juices and rotev, all that stuff, to be mavatil, then I don't have a problem of min b'mino anymore. Because when I remove, so to speak, not literally, but conceptually, the min b'mino element, then I can apply the principle of bittul of shishim by calculating the entire mixture, everything together, and it's called min b'she'eno mino. Now, one point that we have to keep in mind here before we start the Mishnah is the following. What do I do in my calculation with the other pieces of meat? But we said salik esmino k'mishe'eno. Once I apply that, I view the piece of meat as one entity with the rest, the remainder of the pot, of the ingredients in the pot. And if that be the case, then my calculation against the Isur in trying to get Shishim will include not just the rotev and the atzomos and all the liquids and so forth and so on. It would also include the piece of meat. You'll ask me, how can you include the piece of meat? It's min b'mino. But the answer is now we're putting aside the principle of min b'mino in order to apply the principle of min b'sheno. And once we apply min b'sheno mino, which is batal b'shishim, and we calculate the shishim of bittul, then we have bittul. Now you might ask me another question. Okay, you had bittul, but now let's apply min b'mino. No, you can't do that. Once you applied min b'mino, once you applied min b'sheno mino, and you applied the principle of bittul, then everything is batal. We're not going to say choser v'nir, it goes back, and it gets resurrected, and now we should call it min b'mino. Okay, now the Mishnah here on Daf Kuf Amid Beis is going to record a machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda that touches on a lot of different issues. It's going to overlap with the issue that we discussed once in the past called Gid Anoshe B'Nosein Tam or Ein Begin B'Nosein Tam. How do we view the Gid? Does it have a taste or is it like a piece of wood? And it's going to overlap with the principle of Ein Isur Chalal Isur. Once you have one Isur, you can't put on another Isur. But the fundamental issue that the Mishnah addresses head on is what's the status of the Gid Anoshe of a non-kosher animal? A non-kosher animal has a Gid Anoshe no less than a kosher animal. Should we say that the Isur Gid Anoshe is chal even on a non-kosher animal? Now you might ask me, Ma'anef Gemina. It's anyway a non-kosher animal. I can't eat it. But the answer is, how many sets of malchus would I give someone who chas v'shalom ate the Gid Anoshe of a non-kosher animal? Rabbi Yehuda, the Mishnah says the following. Noig b'Torah, v'yeinu noig b'Torah. So the Tanakama holds that there's no such thing as a Gid Anoshe that's prohibited by the Torah in the case of a non-kosher animal. And that has to do with the principle of Ein Isur Chalal Isur. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Af b'Tmeya. Even a non-kosher animal has an Isur Gid Anoshe. And if you eat the Gid Anoshe of a non-kosher animal, in addition to being chayiv for non-kosher animal, you're chayiv for Gid Anoshe. Omar Rabbi Yehuda, I'm going to prove my point. At what point in history did the Isur Gid Anoshe emerge? It was given to Bnei Yaakov. Al Kain Bnei Yisrael lo yochlu es Gid Anoshe. V'adayin behemet tmeya muteres. They were Bnei Noach, and Bnei Noach are allowed to eat non-kosher meat. So there's no principle here of Ein Isur Chalal Isur. If the Torah prohibits Gid Anoshe to the Bnei Yaakov, then there's no overlap here of Behemet Tmeya. So why are you telling me that, well, you know what? It's Behemet Tmeya, it's off limits for Gid Anoshe, and there's no Isur Gid Anoshe in a swine. Why are you telling me that? Truth is that even if I accept Gid Anoshe in a non-kosher animal, and therefore I'm chayiv under two categories, number one, eating non-kosher animal, and number two, for eating Gid Anoshe, I'm going to prove to you that Gid Anoshe applies to a non-kosher animal, because as far as the Bnei Yaakov is concerned, all the animals were the same. There was no Isur Behemet Tmeya, and yet the Torah gave them an Isur Gid Anoshe. Amullah, the Chacham say, what are you talking about? The Isur Gid Anoshe was given at Har Sinai. Now, Rabbi Yehuda is going to say, what, are you playing games with me? The Pasuk is by Yaakov Avinu. After he came out of the Mavak, his wrestling match with the Sarah Shel Esav, the Torah said, Al Kain lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael Gid Anoshe. V'sinei nemar ve'elo shenichtav b'mkomo. What happens is that Gid Anoshe is not given to Bnei Yaakov at the time of Yaakov Avinu. They only get the Isurim that apply at Har Sinai. Why was the pasuk placed over there in that context? Because Al Shema Osid. Because in the future, there's going to be an Isur of Gid Anoshe. And why was it placed there? Because the reason for Gid Anosh is because of the injury of Yaakov Avinu at the hands of Malachos Soroshalis. Fekta Gemara, are you telling me that according to Rabbi Yehuda, if a person eats from a non-kosher animal, Gid Anosh, he gets 2 sets of malchus? I'm going to prove to you that Rabbi Yehuda adopts the principle that 80 Sechal Lisa. And if so, how can you be chayiv for both the Iser of Achilas Behemoth Meah and for the Iser of Achilas Gid Anosh? Can't be both. And where do we see this? In a brisa. The Sanya, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer Yochel Tehei Nivlas Of Tomi Mitami V'Godim Beis HaBliya. We have a halach that if you eat the nevela of a bird that died without shechita, the bird itself was a kosher bird, but he didn't shecht it. So once he swallows some of that nevela of the oaf, again a kosher oaf, then it's mitame bebeis habliya. It's all the begodim that he's wearing become tummy. Now, what happens in the case of a non-kosher bird? Let's say, for example, a raven. So the raven is killed, and then he eats the basar. I don't know how much basar is on a raven, but he eats it. And Rabbi Yehuda says, you might entertain the idea that it should be mitame b'beis habliya, and all the chumras of tumah b'beis habliya that apply to an oftar should apply to an oftami as well. How do we dash in this pasuk? Mishi surah mishum bal tochal nevela. Such a classic drasha. If the Iser is an Iser of nevela, is then we say that it's mitame b'beis habliya begodim shal yatsa zesheni sur mishum bal tocha nevela. Forget about the fact that this raven gepegered, he died, and his basar is a carcass, and it's a. Forget about that. Any surah mishum bal tochal nevela. There's no isa nevela in an oftame, because ain't isa chal isa. You can't apply the principle of nevela as a separate iser on top of the iser of a non-kosher bird. Now, what do we see from Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda is holding that there's no iser nevela in an oftame. Why? Because of ein iser chal iser. The iser of of tameh precludes the iser of nevela when the animal dies. And if that be the case, when we have gid anosha that should be chal on a behemoth meah, so we should apply the principle of ein iser chal iser. And yet, Rabbi Yehuda holds that there'll be both gid anosha and nevela and behemoth meah that are both chal. You get 2 sets of malchus. Whatever happened to ein iser chal iser? The Gemara offers the following possible solution, that maybe Rabbi Yehuda holds ein begidim b'no same time, because somebody goes utmeya nami iser gid ika iser tmeya leka. When he eats the gid, he's not chayav for eating a behemoth meah. The gid is a piece of wood, has no time. If it has no time, it's not basar, and if it's not basar, there's no iser basar of a non-kosher animal. So what are you left with? You're left with gid anosha. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, gid anosha was already given to Bnei Yisrael, to the Shiftei Kah, at the time when they didn't have kosher meat. So the Gemara says, that can't be right. So Rabbi Yehuda ain't beginning mosein tam v'atan. You're going to bring a brisa and proof from this brisa that Rabbi Yehuda holds yesh beginning b'nosein tam. Hochel gid anosha shel behemoth meah Rabbi Yehuda mechayev shtayim. you're going to get 2 sets of malchus for eating the gid anosha of a behemoth tmeya. First of all, you're eating a behemoth tmeya, and secondly, you're eating gid anosha. Why are you eating behemoth tmeya? It must be because yesh begidim in osei tam. So now we're back to square one, and we still don't understand how a non-kosher species could be subject to an additional iser of gid anosha. What happened to ein iser chal iser? And Rabbi Yehuda holds ein iser chal iser, as we saw by an oftame. And you can't tell me that Rabbi Yehuda holds yesh begin min osein tam because Rabbi Yehuda happens. I'm sorry, ein begin min osein tam because Rabbi Yehuda happens to hold yesh begin min osein tam. Liolam says Gemara Savar yesh begin min osein tam. As we proved from the case where you get 2 sets of malchus feeding the gid anosh of behemoth tmeya, but kasavar noig b'shilya the isu gid anosh. We have a technical rule with regard to ein iser chalis, and that is that if 2 isurim emerge simultaneously, then both are chal. Now, the beginning of the creation or formation of the animal, the fetus, we have 2 things happening simultaneously. The iser of behemoth tmeya and the iser of gid anosh. And that's called Rabbi Yehuda kasavar noig b'shlil. Shlil means the fetus. So you already have a gid anosha iser as soon as the animal begins to be formed as a fetus in its mother's womb. So at that point, you have both the iser of behemoth tmeya and the iser of gid anosha chalim simultaneously. They take effect. Gemara says, "Umimatzis amruf noig b'shilya b'shlil." Now we're going to have to introduce Rabbi Yochanan. No. Just 1 second. Did I get this right? Is it? No, we're not ready for Rabbi Yochanan. I don't want to jump the gun. What we're going to do now is we're going to remind ourselves of a Mishnah that we learned 11 days ago. But Tanan noig b'shlil Rabbi Yehuda Omer eino noig b'shlil l'chel b'muta. So what's the case? The case is you have a fetus in its mother's womb. You shechted the mother, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that none of the surim that apply to a separate, independent animal entity will apply now because the fetus is viewed as part of the mother. It's not like a limb of the mother's body, and the only limb of the mother's body that's gid anosha is the gid anosha. The only chalev that's also in the mother's body is the chalev, but not the gid anosha or the chalev of the fetus. So you can't tell me that Rabbi Yehuda holds that at the moment of the formation of this fetus is already iser of gid anosha, when Rabbi Yehuda goes on record as saying in the Mishnah that eino noig b'shlil. So the Gemara answers, Hani mili tahora drachmana omer kol bebehema tochelu. When does Rabbi Yehuda hold that there's no iser gid anosha in the shlil, in the fetus? That's only because you have a kosher animal. The mother is a kosher animal, and you shechted the mother. Once you shecht the mother, we view the shechita as if it's valid even as far as the fetus is concerned, because the fetus is viewed and defined as part of the mother's body. And if that be the case, Rabbi Yehuda says that eino noig b'shlil. Avol b'tmeya nohei. But in the case of a tmeya where there's no shechita, and you can't say therefore that the shechita of the mother was effective for the fetus in its mother's womb, and therefore we could suggest that Rabbi Yehuda would hold yesh gid anosha b'shlil in a case of behemoth tmeya. And the Gemara rejects. Now we're going to introduce Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is going to differentiate between two stages in the two embryonic stages in the formation of the fetus. There's the Avarim and the Gidim. The Avarim are the limbs, and the Gidim are the sinews. And Rabbi Yochanan is going to say that there's a point in time where the limbs of the fetus are already beginning to form, but not the sinews. And that we're going to see as Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of a Mishnah in Nazir. Now, the Mishnah in Nazir is dealing with Tiglachas Nazir, which means that if the Nazir, who's enjoined from any contact with the dead, or even as we'll see, part of a dead body, if he goes ahead and he comes in contact with the dead, he becomes Tomei. And once he becomes Tomei, then he has to do what's called Tiglachas. He's got to shave off his head, the hair off his head. Al elu tumas hanozim megaleach. So the Mishnah sets up in Masechta Nazir two categories of tumah, which are so severe that the Nazir, if he comes in contact with one of those two categories, he's got to go through Tiglachas Nazir. And what are the two categories? Al mes, he came in contact. Mr. Nazir came in contact with a corpse of a dead body. The al-kazayis min ames. Well, you need the kazayis min ames. So what's the al-mes? Where are your two categories over here? The kashalon, al-kazayis min ames megalech, al-ames kulo l'kolshken. If he comes in contact with the entire body of the corpse, how much more so? Are you telling me all you need is the kazayis min ames? Rabbi Yochanan lo nischal nefel shelo niskashru evarav begidin. We're talking about an aborted fetus in that middle stage. It's after the beginning of the formation of the limbs, but before the formation of the sinews. And the chiddush of the Mishnah is when it says alames. Forget about kizayis minames. Alames is we're talking about coming in contact with an aborted fetus after the limbs were already formed, and that's considered like a corpse. Alma, what do we see? That Isur Tumah Kodim. We know that the Isur Tumah of a non-kosher animal begins at the very moment it begins to be formulated as an embryo. And for that, certainly the limbs being formulated is sufficient. But a gid is a sinew. And we saw in Rabbi Yochanan that the sinews do not emerge, do not develop until a later stage. So once again, we have to apply the principle of ein isur chal isur. What did you want to answer me? No, both isurim of behemoth tmeya and gid anosha emerge simultaneously. That can't be true according to Rabbi Yochanan, because the isur tmeya already sets in with limbs, even before the sinew, so gid anosha comes later. The Gemara says, "Afal gav the isur tumah kodim os isur gid v'chayil shekein isur b'bnei." The Gemara says the following: that forget about analyzing chronologically which isur came first, and then applying ein isur chal isur to gid anosha because it came after the isur of behemoth tmeya. No, forget about that. We're going to limit, or shall I say, disqualify the principle, the application of the principle of ein isur chal isur, if the second isur is more chomer than the first isur, and gid anosha is more chomer than behemoth tmeya. How so? Because the behemoth tmeya, a pig, is only also to a Jew, not to a guy. But Gid Anosha is also even to a guy. And again, that reflects the shita of Rabbi Yehuda and Mishnah that Gid Anosha applies even to Bnei Noach. Because if you recall, there was no such thing as a behemoth tmeya to the shiftei kah because they, before Har-Sinai, they had the status of Bnei Noach, and yet the Torah prohibited Gid Anosha. They can now be the Ketonium Rabbi Yehuda v'alo Bnei Yaakov Nesar Gid Anosha v'adayin behemoth tmeya muteres lehem. So we see that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the Bnei Yaakov had the status of Bnei Noach, and Rabbi Yehuda L'shitaso holds that we read that pasuk Pshuto in its context, that even Bnei Noach are prohibited from Gid Anosha, and the Bnei Yaakov are a very interesting scenario because on the one hand, they don't have an Isur Behemoth Tmeya because they are Bnei Noach, but yet, paradoxically, the Torah says they can't eat the Gid Anosha. So the final conclusion of this, if we summarize this whole sugya, is that Rabbi Yehuda holds that you could be chayav 80 lashes for eating a Gid Anosha v'behemoth tmeya, and you violate both Isurim, and there's no problem of any Isur Chalisa because the Isur Gid Anosha is more chamur than the Isur of behemoth tmeya insofar as the Isur Gid Anosha applies even to Bnei Noach. Now, let's just take a look at the clock. I think we have a few more minutes. And I'd like to go back and discuss with you this principle called min b'mino yavesh b'yavesh batel b'ro. So what was the case? We had a piece of non-kosher meat that fell into and got mixed up with two pieces of kosher meat. We have 4 shitos in Rishonim. The first sheet is the Rosh. The Rosh holds that this bittul, chad betray 1 and 2, eat all 3. It's pretty mind-boggling. You know, remember Ripley's Believe It or Not. Here's a halachic Ripley's Believe It or Not. When, according to one shita, are you allowed to eat nevela? And it's not pikuach nefesh. The answer is that a piece of nevela got mixed up with 2 pieces of kosher meat. You can eat the nevela. I don't know which piece is the nevela, but it's butter. That's the Shitas HaRosh. The Rashba, on the other hand, says that you always have to have the possibility of saying that you're not eating the nevela. So when you take 1 piece from the 3, you're allowed to say, well, this is not the nevela, it belongs to the other 2. Now I eat the second piece of meat, and I say, this is not the nevela. One of the other 2 pieces of meat is nevela, which means I might have eaten the nevela already. So according to the Rashba, you can eat all 3 pieces of meat, but not in one fell swoop, not in one gulp, but b'zecher. Now we get to the Shita Tosas. Tosas says, you cannot get into a situation where you definitely are eating nevela. What you can do is divvy up the 3 pieces of meat. Reuven will eat 1, Shimon another, and Levi the 3rd. There's no one single individual that is certainly, definitely eating nevela. And then we have the shita of Rashi. Rashi says you can't eat all 3 pieces of meat. You can't divide them up into 3 pieces. You got to take 1 piece of meat out and throw it into the Yam HaMelech and discard it. And then you have a right to say tliya, that whenever you eat the other 2 pieces of meat, you're going to say the piece of meat that I threw into the Yam HaMelech was the Isur. Okay, let's just see where we're holding for tomorrow's response, our homework assignment for tomorrow for Shabbos. We're up to Gufa on Daf Kufa Mid Beis, in which case we go back to Rabbi Yehuda's Shita that if you eat the Gid Anosha of a non-kosher animal, you get 2 sets of Malchus. But the real Chiddush now in the Gemara on Daf Kuf Aleph for tomorrow's Daf is Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says you're not chayiv at all. You're not chayiv for Behemet Tmeya. You're not chayiv for Gid Anosha. You're not chayiv for Behemet Tmeya because you ate the Gid Anosha and ein beginning b'no same time. It's not basar, it's eitz. You're not chayiv for Gid Anosha. That's the problem. Why aren't you chayiv for Gid Anosha? I mean, you're eating the Gid Anosha. But the answer is there's no Isur Gid Anosha in a Behemet Tmeya. Because if there would be, you would be violating the principle of Ein Isur Challi. So that's for tomorrow. For Sunday, we get to Kuf Beis. That's at noon. Same time on Monday, and we make a siyum on Monday of Perek Gid Anosha Mitzvah. All right then, so I wish you a great Shabbos. Thank you so much. And thank you so much also for accommodating my needs on this vacation. Baruch Hashem, we didn't miss a day.